Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a little trip back to the Roman Empire. So, grab some tea, dim the lights, and try not to picture too much blood, because yes, we are technically talking about Roman entertainment, and entertainment here meant watching people being mauled by lions. Not exactly Netflix and chill, but hey, it worked for them. So, Rome, that shiny marble empire that somehow convinced half the world that togas were a good fashion choice. When we think of Rome, we think of grandeur, aqueducts, Julius Caesar doing his ET2 brute thing, and of course, the Colosseum, which, in case you've never seen it in person, is basically a massive, crumbling donut where hundreds of thousands of people once screamed at the top of their lungs because a man in a leather skirt just stabbed another guy with a trident. Now, I should warn you, Romans love games. But by games, I don't mean hopscotch. I mean things like, what if we took 50 prisoners of war, shoved them into an arena, and released a few wild boars just to see what happens? And the audience, which could be anyone from senators to your average breadline peasant, would cheer, laugh, or occasionally just yawn and ask for more. Because after a while, even death stops being exciting when you see it every weekend. But before we dive into the gore, don't worry, we'll keep this nice and sleepy. Let's set the scene. Imagine you're in Rome in, say, the 1st century CE. The empire is booming. Emperors are strutting around calling themselves gods, and every single one of them knows one golden rule. If you want the people on your side, you give them bread and circuses. Bread, because food is nice. Circuses, because apparently people need to watch other humans getting chopped to pieces in order to feel fulfilled. So, let's float over to the games themselves. What exactly did games mean in ancient Rome? The technical term was ludi, literally, games. They came in a few flavors. Chariot races, theatrical performances, mock sea battles, and of course, the most infamous, gladiatorial combat. And trust me, gladiators were not like Russell Crowe in Gladiator. They were usually slaves, prisoners, or just really desperate men who thought, sure, fighting half-naked in front of 50,000 people sounds like a career path. And the audience? They were picky. They didn't just want one guy stabbing another. No, that would get boring. They wanted themes, drama, costumes, exotic animals. Think of it like reality TV, but with lions. You know how the Bachelor producers always add random twists to keep things spicy? Well, Roman emperors did the same. But instead of introducing a surprise contestant, they'd just toss a giraffe into the arena. Because why not? Let's start with the gladiators. These guys were the backbone of Roman bloodsport. They had schools. Yes, actual schools, where they were trained to fight. It wasn't just swinging swords randomly. It was choreographed, stylized, almost artistic. Different gladiators had different specialties. The retiarius fought with a net and trident, like a fisherman who decided violence was a hobby. The secutor had heavy armor and a sword. And if you put them against each other, the crowd would go wild, because nothing screams drama like guy with fishing net versus human tank. Of course, the emperors made sure these fights weren't just about skill. They were about spectacle. Emperor Titus, for example, when he inaugurated the Colosseum in 80 CE, went all out. He hosted 100 days of games. That's right, 100 days straight of people fighting, animals being slaughtered, and enough blood to fill a swimming pool. Casual. Imagine being a Roman and saying, "Oh yeah, last week I saw a man fight a rhino. What are you doing next weekend?" Probably more rhinos. And then there was Commodus. Yes, the one played by Joaquin Phoenix in Gladiator. He really did fight in the arena. Except, he was emperor, which meant he always won. He'd stroll into the Colosseum, dressed in shiny armor, and stabbed some terrified opponent who wasn't even allowed to stab back. The crowd cheered anyway, because, well, what else are you going to do when your emperor has a sword and a fragile ego? But gladiators were just one part of the carnage buffet. The Romans also had something called venations. These were animal hunts staged inside the arena. Lions, leopards, elephants, ostriches, you name it. Rome probably killed it for fun. There's even a story about a rhino fight where the poor rhino was goaded into charging around the arena until it basically keeled over. Sometimes the Romans imported animals from across the empire, giraffes from Africa, crocodiles from Egypt, bears from Gaul. If the Roman Empire touched it, they dragged it to the Colosseum and said, "Congratulations, you're now entertainment." Of course, animal rights activists weren't really a thing in ancient Rome. In fact, people complained not that it was cruel, but that the animals weren't exotic enough. Imagine a Roman audience sighing, "Ugh, another lion? So last season, bring out the hippos already." And yes, there were hippos, because apparently, drowning in a flooded arena while a hippo chomped at your ankles was considered peak entertainment. Which brings us neatly to another form of Roman game, the naumachii, or mock-sea battles. Picture this. The Romans flood the Colosseum or another large basin, build little ships, and then force prisoners to fight naval battles for the audience. Imagine being dragged into a fake ocean just so you can reenact the Battle of Actium in front of 50,000 sweaty spectators. Glamorous, right? But the weirdest part of all this? These games weren't even considered cruel by Roman standards. They were moral. The idea was that watching bravery in the face of death would inspire the audience. See, if a gladiator fought well and died honorably, the crowd could go home feeling oddly uplifted. Like, wow, that man just got his head bashed in by a mace, but at least he looked noble doing it. I, too, will face my daily bread line with courage. And gladiators themselves could become celebrities. Some had fan clubs, graffiti carved in their honor, and even love letters. Women apparently swooned over gladiators, scars and all, which is slightly ironic, considering these men spent most of their lives in chains and could be killed at the whim of a referee's thumbs down. But hey, in Rome, if you had muscles and a sword, you were basically a rock star. Now, let's glide over to another bizarre aspect, executions. Because Romans didn't just do boring executions. Oh no, they turned them into plays. Literally, a condemned man might be dressed up as a mythological figure, say, Orpheus, and then thrown to wild animals in front of everyone. It was called damnatio ad bestias, and the audience ate it up, because apparently nothing says family fun like watching someone reenact Hercules before being mauled by a bear. Some historians estimate that over the centuries, hundreds of thousands of people and animals died in these games, which is a sobering number if you think about it. But the Romans didn't. For them, it was just Saturday entertainment. Bread, circuses, and maybe a jug of wine. So why did it all happen? Well, partly politics. Emperors used games to keep the people distracted. If the empire was struggling, if taxes were high, if there was famine, just throw 100 gladiators into the arena and the people would cheer instead of riot. It's basically the Roman equivalent of giving away free iPhones to distract from bad headlines. And partly, it was culture. Romans loved to show off their power. What better way to prove Rome's dominance than to say, "Look, we can import tigers from halfway across the world, kill them for sport, and still have enough left over to make carpets." But the irony, of course, is that while the games were meant to display Roman strength, they also drained resources, money, and even manpower. Some emperors bankrupted themselves funding massive spectacles just to keep the crowd happy. And when the empire started to decline, so did the games. By the 5th century, gladiatorial combat was banned, which is probably for the best, because honestly, how many more rhinos could they possibly find? So, we've set the stage for Rome's bloody entertainment industry. Gladiators, animals, mock-sea battles, you name it, the Romans probably forced someone to do it. But here's where things get almost funny. The emperors themselves got really into the games. And when I say into, I don't mean they just enjoyed watching. Some of them practically moved into the Colosseum like it was their personal man cave. Let's start with the obvious guy, Commodus. Remember him? Emperor in the late 2nd century CE, known mostly for being unhinged, egotistical, and apparently allergic to doing actual emperor work. If you've seen Gladiator, you know Joaquin Phoenix gave him a very creepy performance. And the real Commodus? Yeah, not much better. Commodus decided he was basically Hercules reborn. He literally dressed up in lion skins, carried a club, and strutted around like he was a demigod. And of course, if you believe you're Hercules, what better way to prove it than fighting in the arena? So he did. Now, before you imagine Commodus bravely facing lions and seasoned gladiators, let's adjust expectations. He mostly fought disabled gladiators, terrified prisoners, or just random animals chained to posts. It was less heroic combat, and more grown man with delusions of grandeur stabbing helpless things for applause. But Rome being Rome, the audience cheered anyway. Because, really, who's going to boo the emperor holding a sword? That's a quick way to end up in the sand yourself. One source claims Commodus killed hundreds of animals in a single day. Lions, ostriches, elephants. Basically, if it had a pulse and Rome could drag it into the arena, Commodus poked it with something sharp. And the best part? He charged Rome for the privilege. That's right. He billed the city treasury every time he performed, because apparently even emperors needed appearance fees. At one point, he even staged a show where he killed an ostrich, strutted around the arena holding its severed head, and then gestured at the senators in the audience like, "You're next." Sleepy little family outing, right? Nothing like a casual death threat served with your bread and wine. Now, Commodus wasn't alone in being theatrical. Let's float back a century earlier to Titus, the emperor who gave Rome the Colosseum. He only ruled for 2 years, but he definitely left a mark, mostly by bankrupting himself with a giant festival. When the Colosseum opened in 80 CE, Titus decided to throw the ultimate launch party. Today, we cut a ribbon or smash a champagne bottle against a cruise ship. Titus? He gave Rome 100 consecutive days of games. Imagine 3 straight months of nothing but fights, hunts, and executions. Romans were basically like, "Cool, I'll see you at the arena after work." Again, the scale was ridiculous. Thousands of gladiators fought. Exotic animals from across the empire were slaughtered. There are even reports of entire naval battles staged inside the Colosseum, which they somehow flooded for the occasion. And because Titus loved a theme, the shows often reenacted famous myths. So you might see a condemned criminal dressed as Icarus, flying, with wings, and then promptly being set on fire. Subtle. Of course, this wasn't cheap. Feeding and transporting lions, giraffes, and hippos across continents isn't exactly a budget-friendly hobby. But Titus wanted to make sure Rome never forgot who gave them their shiny new stadium. So, yes, he went big. And then, conveniently, he died the next year, which honestly might have been a mercy for his accountants. Let's drift now to Nero, because if there was ever an emperor who treated life like his own variety show, it was him. Nero loved performing, singing, acting, playing instruments. He forced Roman elites to sit through hours of his musical recitals. And yes, people pretended to faint just to escape. And of course, he loved games. Nero's spectacles were odd. He didn't just stick to gladiator fights. He combined them with elaborate theatrical productions. Think of it like a Broadway show, but instead of actors pretending to die, you had actual convicts being burned alive for realism. Nothing like a little authenticity, right? He once hosted games that lasted for months, with thousands of animals killed, and entire artificial lakes created for mock naval battles. And Nero being Nero, he didn't watch passively. He sometimes appeared on stage or in the arena himself. Because what's the point of being emperor if you can't demand a standing ovation for your mediocre liar skills? And then there was Caligula. Now, Caligula had a reputation for, let's say, poor judgment. He adored the games, but often in the most inconvenient ways. For instance, he'd randomly cancel scheduled events because he was bored, or worse, because he wanted to punish the crowd. Imagine waiting all day to watch Gladiators, only for the emperor to suddenly announce, "Nah, no games today. Instead, I'm executing a few random people I don't like." Big letdown. He also reportedly ordered wild animals starved before hunts, just to make the fights bloodier. And once, when he ran out of criminals to execute, he casually threw in members of the audience. Surprise participation round. Nothing like realizing you're not just there to watch the games. You might actually be the games. So, as you can see, the emperors treated the Colosseum like their personal YouTube channel. Titus uploaded the blockbuster special. Nero went for musical theater. Caligula did chaotic improv. And Commodus? Well, Commodus basically live-streamed his own ego trip until someone finally got tired of it and killed him. Which, frankly, was long overdue. Now, let's take a slow turn from emperors to the people who made these games possible, the gladiators themselves. Because contrary to the Hollywood version, most gladiators didn't look like chiseled action stars. They were slaves, prisoners of war, or sometimes desperate free men who volunteered for money and fame. And their training schools? Brutal. The biggest gladiator school was in Capua, and it trained thousands. Trainees lived in barracks, ate a surprisingly high-carb diet, barley mush, beans, bread. Gladiators were nicknamed barley men, and spent their days practicing combat under strict supervision. Discipline was harsh, and escapes were rare, though not impossible. The most famous case? Spartacus. Yes, Spartacus was real. A Thracian soldier captured and sold into slavery. He ended up at Capua. In 73 BCE, he and about 70 fellow gladiators broke out using kitchen knives, grabbed some weapons, and sparked a full-scale slave revolt. Within 2 years, Spartacus led an army of tens of thousands. Rome was humiliated, panicked, and eventually crushed the rebellion. But the fact that gladiators managed to terrify the Roman state? That's quite the legacy. Back in the arena, gladiators fought in pairs, carefully chosen to maximize entertainment. Heavy armor against light. Net versus sword. Speed versus strength. And while yes, they often died, it wasn't always a death sentence. Gladiators were expensive to train. If a fighter was skilled or entertaining, referees might spare them. The famous thumbs down gesture? Historians aren't even sure it meant death. It might have meant sheath your sword instead. Hollywood just decided death was more dramatic. Still, careers were short. Even if you survived fights, injuries piled up. Infection, exhaustion, accidents. Few gladiators enjoyed long retirements. But those who did survive long enough could sometimes earn freedom, wealth, or even celebrity status. There's graffiti in Pompeii where women brag about sleeping with gladiators. Because apparently, nothing says romantic like a man who might be eaten by a leopard tomorrow. So, to sum up this part, emperors treated the arena like their personal playgrounds. The crowd treated it like the ancient version of binge watching. And gladiators? They were the unfortunate stars of the show, adored by some, chewed up by the system, and occasionally lucky enough to rebel. And that was just the people. We haven't even gotten into the animals yet. So let's slowly wander over to the menageries of Doom Rome imported for its audiences. Because if you thought the human side was bad, wait until you hear what happened to elephants in the Colosseum. Alright, that was our first little dive into the darkness. I hope you're still awake, or maybe already half asleep. Either way, let's ease into the second story, because history has plenty more uncomfortable experiments to share. Part 2. The Real Human Experiments of World War II. In this part, we are going to tell you the story of the world's creepiest science fair project, the human experiments of World War II. Not the kind with baking soda volcanoes, or what happens if you put Mentos in Coke. Nope. This is the kind where people in white coats, with too much free time and way too much state funding, decided to ask, what if we froze someone to death? Just to see. The general vibe of wartime science. World War II had no shortage of chaos, bloodshed, and questionable decision-making. But one of its more fun legacies was the way certain governments thought. Hey, what if we used war prisoners as unpaid lab rats? Because apparently, invading Poland wasn't enough. You also needed to measure how long someone could sit in ice water before they died. And here's the part that makes it worse. These weren't fringe, mad scientist in a cave types. No, these were university-trained doctors. Some were even respected before the war. They wore actual lab coats, used clipboards, and wrote down notes as if they were working on the cure for cancer. Except, spoiler alert, they weren't curing anything. They were basically cosplaying as science heroes while conducting what were, let's be honest, torture sessions with a stopwatch, freezing people for knowledge. So let's start with the Nazis. Always a crowd favorite when it comes to making bad choices. One of their obsessions was hypothermia. Germany being a cold place, and military pilots constantly crashing into the North Sea, they figured, well, what happens when people are stuck in icy water? And you would think they could have figured this out using, oh I don't know, dummies, simulations, or maybe not launching pilots into poorly heated cockpits in the first place. But no, they brought in prisoners from Dachau concentration camp, stripped them, and dumped them into freezing water baths. The experiment was basically, put someone in icy water, wait until they lost consciousness, and then sometimes try to revive them. Sometimes not. Scientific rigor, folks. One method of rewarming was called animal heat, which, if you're imagining something awkward, yes, you're right. They literally threw hypothermic prisoners into bed with women, hoping that skin-to-skin contact would bring their temperature back up. Congratulations, the Nazis invented cuddling as a medical treatment, except in the least romantic context imaginable. Pressure chambers, because why not? And then there were the pressure experiments. The Luftwaffe wanted to know how high their pilots could fly without exploding lungs. Logical, maybe, but again, not worth testing on actual humans in captivity. At Dachau, they shoved people into low-pressure chambers to simulate high-altitude flight, which sounds like a terrible carnival ride. The subjects would lose consciousness. Some convulsed. Some bled from the ears and eyes. And, shockingly, most of them didn't volunteer to go again. Of course, the Nazis wrote it all down in neat little medical papers. The takeaway was basically, yes, people die when you take the air away. Riveting stuff. Dr. Mengel's side hustle. Now, we can't talk about Nazi experiments without giving an uncomfortable nod to everyone's least favorite doctor, Joseph Mengele. This man treated Auschwitz like it was his personal laboratory/playground. His thing? Twins. He wanted to figure out the secrets of genetics. Because obviously, the best way to crack DNA was to inject children with dye and see if their eyes would change color. Spoiler, they didn't. Mengele would measure twins obsessively, weigh them, poke them with needles, and then, when he was done, sometimes kill them just to compare their organs side by side. That's not research. That's the world's darkest spot the difference puzzle. And yes, he wrote all this up with a straight face, as though he was on the verge of unlocking the mysteries of human biology. Meanwhile, he was just proving the groundbreaking fact that injecting people with chemicals tends to end badly. The Japanese version, Unit 731. But don't think this was just a Nazi specialty. Oh no, humanity really outdid itself by spreading the horror around. Enter Japan's Unit 731. If you've never heard of it, congratulations, you're about to sleep even less. This was a top-secret biological and chemical warfare unit in occupied China. Think Mad Science Disneyland, except every ride kills you. Here, they tested plague, anthrax, and cholera on live prisoners. They would literally infect people on purpose, just to see how long it took for their bodies to fall apart. Sometimes they'd even treat them, not to heal, but to observe the progress more carefully. Yes, that's what passed for a controlled study. Vivisection, surgery on live people without anesthesia, was routine, because apparently anesthesia would interfere with results. Which is like saying seatbelts interfere with crash test data. Correct, but also, Have you lost your mind? Frostbite as a hobby. And if you thought hypothermia research was only a Nazi thing, surprise. The Japanese were also curious about frostbite. Soldiers in Manchuria faced brutal winters, so Unit 731 tested it directly. They would take prisoners outside, pour water on their arms and legs, and wait until the skin froze solid. Sometimes they hit the limb with a stick to confirm it was frozen, because apparently knocking on your test subject like a frozen turkey was considered good methodology. Afterwards, they tried treatments, rubbing, hot water, sometimes even fire. None worked well. Who could have guessed? Sleep experiments, the Soviet rumor. Now, you may have heard of the Russian sleep experiment, that internet horror story where Soviet scientists kept prisoners awake until they went insane. Fun fact, that's almost certainly fiction. But here's the less fun fact. The Soviets did dabble in sleep deprivation and psychological stress, just not with creepy gas chambers like the memes say. They used prisoners, sometimes soldiers, to test endurance under extreme stress. No, nobody turned into a monster. But yes, plenty broke down mentally and physically. Which, if you've ever tried pulling an all-nighter in college, you already know sleep deprivation makes people a bit unhinged. The Soviets just took it further and added a lot more suffering. This science problem. What's wild is how these people justified it. They told themselves it was for the good of science, for saving soldiers, for national glory. In reality, almost none of the data was useful. The experiments were sloppy, cruel, and unethical to the point of parody. Modern medicine doesn't really cite Nazi hypothermia tables or Unit 731 frostbite notes. Because, surprise, when your method is torture, your results aren't very reliable. It turns out, science needs consent, controls, and actual ethics. Who knew? Floating to the next horror. So where does that leave us? In the middle of a war where doctors treated humans like lab animals, writing down their findings with the calm detachment of someone taking notes on a salad recipe. And we've only skimmed the surface. There are still malaria experiments, chemical burns, mustard gas trials, and of course, starvation studies, because apparently not feeding people counted as research. The cold calculations of Unit 731. So, let's drift eastward for a while. Because Europe wasn't the only place where human experiments were, let's say, trending. Japan had its own secretive little research project. You might have heard the name Unit 731. And if you haven't, well, it was essentially Japan's version of what if we pretended the Geneva Conventions were just decorative wallpaper? Unit 731 was based in Manchuria, which Japan occupied at the time. On the surface, it looked like a normal military research facility. You know, brick buildings, barbed wire, people in uniforms. But inside, it was more like a science fair project if the theme was how many different ways can humans be dissected. The man behind this operation was General Shiro Ishii. Now, Ishii was a doctor, which already should set off some alarms, because whenever a doctor gets promoted to general, things rarely end with better health care. Ishii was ambitious, clever, and apparently thought the Hippocratic Oath was just a cute poem to recite at medical school graduations. He convinced the Japanese Imperial Army that they absolutely needed a massive biological warfare program. And, well, the army said, sure, why not? What could possibly go wrong? So Unit 731 was born. The victims, and let's be clear, there's no gentler word for them, were mostly Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. They were given a charming nickname by the researchers, logs, as if they weren't people, just pieces of wood stacked for burning, which is about as dehumanizing as you can get. So, what exactly went on in this house of horrors? Well, pretty much everything you'd expect from a mad scientist movie, except this was real. They performed vivisections, which is a polite way of saying cutting people open alive to see what happens. They would deliberately infect prisoners with diseases like plague, cholera, and anthrax, just to watch the symptoms unfold. Sometimes they'd test frostbite treatments by sticking people's arms in freezing water, then smashing the frozen flesh with sticks to observe the effects. You know, very scientific. And just in case you thought they kept things strictly indoors, Unit 731 also believed in field testing. They would drop plague-infested fleas over Chinese villages and then take notes on how fast the outbreak spread. Yes, imagine waking up one day to find out you're basically part of a large-scale science project without consent forms. Of course, the goal of all this was supposedly to help Japan develop biological weapons that could be used in war. But in practice, a lot of it just seems like cruel curiosity. Because when you've already decided some people aren't human, anything can be justified in the name of research. Now, here's where it gets even more surreal. When the war ended and Japan surrendered, you might expect everyone involved in Unit 731 to be hauled into trials and punished for crimes against humanity. And some of them were. But General Ishii and a number of his colleagues were actually offered immunity by the United States in exchange for handing over their research data. Because apparently, the US decided that, yes, this information was horrifying, but also useful. And nothing says moral high ground like a trade deal with war criminals. So Ishii lived out his life peacefully, never tried, never imprisoned. Rumor has it he died of throat cancer in the 1950s, which, considering everything he inflicted on others, feels almost too merciful. And Unit 731 became one of those chilling reminders that sometimes history's darkest chapters aren't the ones people like to talk about at dinner parties. Let's float back westward again. Because while Japan was freezing people's limbs and cultivating plague, Germany still had a few, shall we say, extracurricular projects going on. Perfect. Let's keep gliding along, nice and slow. We'll move back into Europe now. Experiments in the camps. So, back to Europe we go. Because if there's one thing the Nazis weren't short on, it was bad ideas dressed up as science. The camps, Auschwitz, Dachau, Ravensbrück, and the whole tragic list weren't just sites of imprisonment and death. They also became laboratories. And not the fun kind where you mix vinegar and baking soda to make a volcano. No, these were the what if we casually erased ethics and just poke people like lab rats kind. Let's start with the one name that always comes up, Joseph Mengele. His nickname was the Angel of Death, which really tells you all you need to know. But if you're picturing some terrifying monster, you'd be wrong. Witnesses said he was charming, well-dressed, polite. He even smiled often, which honestly makes it worse. Mengele had a special interest in twins. Why twins? Well, partly because Nazi ideology loved the idea of multiplying the perfect Aryan race. If you could figure out the secret of identical twins, maybe you could, I don't know, double up your pure-blooded blonde children like Pokemon breeding. Logical? No. Creepy? Very. So in Auschwitz, when new transports arrived, Mengele would stand on the platform. Among all the chaos and shouting, he'd calmly pick out twins, especially children. He would literally pluck them from the crowd, like someone selecting fruit at a market. Twins went one way, their families the other. And we all know what the other usually meant. Inside the camp, the twins became test subjects. He measured every part of their bodies, arms, heads, eyes, sometimes daily, because apparently watching a child's skull circumference was urgent business. He injected dyes into their eyes to see if he could change their color. Spoiler, he couldn't. He injected diseases into one twin and left the other healthy, just to compare what happened. And when one twin died, which was often, the other would be killed too. So he could examine their organs side by side. Twins, he said, provided a kind of living laboratory, which is just a very tidy euphemism for suffering. And here's the thing, the research never actually produced anything useful. There was no great genetic discovery, no medical breakthrough. It was just endless cruelty, with results written down in neat German handwriting, which is kind of the most Nazi thing ever. Precise, meticulous, and utterly pointless. Now, Mengele wasn't the only one. Over at Dachau, they had what were called hypothermia experiments. Soldiers were fighting in freezing conditions, like on the Eastern Front, and the German military wanted to know how much cold the human body could endure. So, naturally, they stripped prisoners naked and threw them into tubs of icy water. Doctors would then measure how long it took before the heart stopped. Sometimes they tried to revive the subjects afterward by putting them under hot lamps, forcing them into boiling baths, or even laying them next to women for body heat. Spoiler again, most of these methods didn't work, because apparently, killing someone in the name of science doesn't magically create new medical knowledge. At Ravensbrück, which was a camp for women, the experiments had a different theme: wounds and infections. Prisoners had gashes deliberately cut into their legs. Then doctors rubbed dirt, rusty nails, or bits of cloth into the wounds, just to mimic battlefield injuries. And, of course, they got to test different drugs and treatments. Which sounds noble, except for the part where the patients had no choice, and most didn't survive. And in case all of this wasn't enough, let's not forget the pressure chamber experiments. At Dachau, prisoners were put into sealed chambers where air pressure could be manipulated. Sometimes they were lowered as if diving deep underwater, sometimes raised as if flying high into the atmosphere. The goal was to study how Luftwaffe pilots might survive extreme conditions. The reality was, people suffocated, their lungs collapsed, and the researchers stood by taking notes. The Nazis were extremely thorough. They recorded everything: tables, charts, body temperatures, times of death. It's chilling because it was all treated like normal research, like you'd see at a university. Only instead of eager grad students, there were SS doctors in crisp uniforms. And after the war, at the Nuremberg trials, much of this came to light. The world got to read the documents, hear the testimony, and recoil in disgust. And yes, most of these doctors were tried and punished. But the irony? Some of the data, especially from the hypothermia tests, was later studied by Allied researchers. Not because they approved, but because the information existed and it was tempting to use. History has this way of muddying morality when practicality steps in. So, we drift here in this quiet realization. A lot of the so-called science of the camps was less about discovery and more about ideology and cruelty. But it did leave us with a grim reminder that medical progress doesn't mean anything if humanity gets left out of the equation. Let's move gently now, because there were other strange experiments, even beyond the famous names. Quieter, but equally absurd in their own twisted way. Even more Nazi science that nobody asked for. So, we've covered twins, ice baths, and pressure chambers. You'd think that would be enough. But of course not. When you have a regime obsessed with both war and racial ideology, there's always room for one more experiment. Or 20. Let's float first to mustard gas trials. The German army had seen chemical warfare in World War I, and mustard gas was the celebrity guest star of that conflict. By World War II, Germany wasn't using it much on the battlefield. But, just in case, they wanted to study its effects more carefully, which apparently required locking prisoners in chambers and spraying them with gas. Sometimes they simply smeared it on the skin, as if mustard gas was some kind of questionable skincare product. Spoiler, it didn't improve the complexion. What it did do was burn the skin, blister the lungs, and leave people in agony. Scientists would then track how long it took for wounds to heal, or more often, not heal at all. And while we're on the subject of substances you definitely shouldn't ingest, let's talk about the seawater experiments. Now, German troops stationed in places like North Africa sometimes had limited fresh water. And the question arose, what happens if soldiers drink only seawater? Can we make it safe somehow? Logical question. Terrible execution. So at Dachau, prisoners were given nothing but seawater to drink. To make it slightly less deadly, researchers sometimes added chemicals to remove the salt. Spoiler, they didn't work. The subjects, desperate with thirst, reportedly licked freshly mopped floors or even sucked on wet rags, just to get a drop of real water. Imagine being in that state of thirst while uniformed doctors stand nearby with clipboards, nodding thoughtfully. Because apparently hydration was worth a few human lives. Now, if you think it stops there, let's gently drift into sterilization experiments. Because, of course, Nazi ideology wasn't just about conquering territory. It was about controlling who was allowed to have children. The idea was to cleanse the population of anyone considered undesirable: Jews, Roma, disabled people, and so on. And sterilization, well, that seemed like a tidy solution. Doctors at camps like Auschwitz tried all kinds of methods. X-rays to fry reproductive organs, injections of caustic chemicals into the uterus, surgical procedures performed without anesthesia. And the real kicker? Sometimes the experiments didn't even successfully sterilize the victims, but they left them in agony anyway. A great combination: useless science and maximum cruelty. Now here's a particularly strange one. Experiments with polygal, a substance derived from beet and apple pectin. The idea was that if you fed soldiers polygal tablets, their blood would clot faster. Which sounds nice on paper if you're planning for battlefield injuries. So how did the researchers test it? By deliberately wounding prisoners, of course, shooting them, amputating limbs, or otherwise inducing bleeding, then checking how fast they clotted. Imagine explaining that in a medical ethics class today. Yes, we wounded humans on purpose, but don't worry, it was for science. No gold star for you. And for a final touch of absurdity, there were experiments on poisons. Because what good is a war without exotic new ways to kill people? Victims were secretly given poison-laced food just to see what symptoms developed. When that wasn't efficient enough, prisoners were executed with bullets dipped in toxins, so the researchers could examine how the poison worked in real time. Again, not exactly a groundbreaking discovery, except the breakthrough that human cruelty is endlessly inventive. By now you might be noticing a pattern. The Nazis weren't actually doing science in the traditional sense. They weren't running controlled experiments with hypotheses and peer review. They were basically torturing people and scribbling down observations, as if suffering itself was a data point. And yet, all of it was carefully documented, filed, and sometimes even published in secret reports. After the war, at the doctor's trial in Nuremberg, the world got to see how extensive all of this had been. The court called it crimes against humanity, which is just the legal way of saying this was about as low as humans can sink. The judges weren't impressed by the scientific defenses. No groundbreaking cure, no genius medical advancement came from it. Just pain, written down in charts. So, let's exhale slowly here. That was a lot. And while Nazi experiments are often the most infamous, it's worth remembering that other countries also dipped their toes, sometimes their whole legs, into human experimentation during the same era. Different motivations, different levels of horror, but the same basic disregard for the person on the table. I hope that second story gave you a sense of how strange things could get. Let's float gently into our third story now. Another chapter in this long, unsettling history. Part 3. The strange jobs people had in the Middle Ages. You know how people today complain about their jobs? The endless emails, the managers who think circle back is a personality trait, and the eternal hell of Zoom meetings that should have been emails? Well, spare a thought for people in the Middle Ages. Because compared to them, your 9 to 5 isn't just tolerable, it's luxury. So, dim the lights, settle into bed, and let's drift back in time to an era where the job market was, how shall we say, creatively horrifying. This is the story of the strange, bizarre, and often disgusting jobs people actually did for a living. And no, these aren't metaphors. These were real occupations, with real titles, and in some cases, oddly enough, real prestige. Let's start with the one that always makes the top of every list. The gong farmer. Yes, you heard that right. A gong farmer. Now, you might imagine this sounds kind of poetic. Someone tending mystical gongs, perhaps keeping a medieval spa running smoothly with relaxing bell sounds. But no, the gong farmer was not a musician. He was not even vaguely spiritual. The word gong, in this context, was a delightful euphemism for human waste. Yep, the gong farmer was, quite literally, the medieval toilet cleaner. See, medieval castles and towns had these lovely things called cesspits, and as the name politely suggests, they were pits, full of cess, which is a fancy way of saying that they were holes brimming with centuries of accumulated human excrement. And these pits did not empty themselves. No magic flushing mechanism. No plumbing. Just good old-fashioned human labor. Enter the gong farmer. His job was to climb down into the pits. Yes, climb, and shovel the mess out by hand. At night. Because apparently, it was considered improper to do it during the day. Imagine it. Pitch black, foul air, knee-deep in other people's business, and just you and a shovel. And if you're wondering how one even survives that environment, well, many didn't. It turns out cesspits produce toxic gases. So, death by cesspit fumes was basically an occupational hazard. But here's the part that might make you pause. Gong farmers were actually pretty well paid, at least by medieval standards. Nobody wanted the job, so demand was high. Which makes sense, because once a cesspit overflowed, things got very unpleasant for everyone. Think of them as medieval sanitation engineers, except without the engineering degree and with a constant risk of drowning in human waste. So yes, the next time your boss asks you to stay late for a meeting, just remember, you could have been a gong farmer. The rat catcher. Let's move from waste management to pest control. Another delightful medieval occupation was the rat catcher. Now, you're probably imagining a man with a little net and a bag of tricks, maybe a medieval version of pest control in a branded van. Not quite. Rats in the Middle Ages weren't just a nuisance. They were practically a biblical plague on four legs. And worse, they were often carriers of fleas, which carried bubonic plague. You know, the Black Death. So having rats running around your home wasn't just annoying, it was potentially lethal. Enter the rat catcher, who had the prestigious duty of, well, catching rats. His toolkit usually included traps, dogs, and sometimes even ferrets, which were unleashed into barns and homes to flush the rodents out. Rat catchers also carried around dead rats as proof of their work, which, let's be honest, must have been one of the least appealing marketing strategies in history. But here's the weirdest part. Many rat catchers didn't just kill rats. They bred them. On purpose. Because you can't show off your rat catching skills if you don't have rats to catch. So yes, imagine hiring someone to clear your home of pests, only to realize that they've been secretly running a rat breeding business on the side. It's like calling pest control today, and they show up with a suitcase full of cockroaches they've been raising at home. Medieval job security at its finest. The professional mourner. Now, let's turn away from filth and rodents to something a little more theatrical. The professional mourner. Yes, in the Middle Ages, grief could be outsourced. Here's how it worked. When someone important died, usually a noble or wealthy merchant, it was considered appropriate to have a very public display of sorrow. The louder the wailing, the more respect was shown to the deceased. But here's the catch. Not everyone was capable of producing Oscar-worthy tears on command. So families hired professionals. These professional mourners, usually women, would show up at funerals and cry. Loudly, dramatically, sometimes rolling on the ground, tearing their clothes, and generally making a scene. And all of it was for pay. The bigger the funeral, the more mourners you hired. Think of it as medieval emotional landscaping. Some were so good at their craft that they became well known across towns. You could imagine people saying, "Oh, if you want the best wailing at your husband's funeral, you've got to hire Marjorie. Nobody screams quite like her." Of course, this job had its downsides. For one, it wasn't exactly stable employment. Your income depended on how many people in your town were dying at any given moment. But at least it was cleaner than cesspits. The court jester. And then, of course, we have the court jester. Now, most people today imagine jesters as colorful clowns, hopping around in silly hats, telling bad jokes. Which isn't entirely wrong. But the reality was a little more complicated. Jesters weren't just comedians. They were part entertainers, part political commentators, and part scapegoats. Their job was to amuse kings and nobles, which was no small feat when your audience had the power to execute you for being unfunny. Imagine doing stand-up where a bad punchline could literally cost your head. But here's the surprising part. Jesters sometimes had more freedom than anyone else in the court. Because they were considered fools, they could say things to the king that nobody else dared. They could mock nobles, point out hypocrisy, and even criticize policy, disguised as jokes. They were kind of like medieval late-night hosts, except their audience was one guy in a crown who could kill them at any moment. Some jesters became close advisors to kings, trusted precisely because their jokes carried truth. Of course, others ended up as nothing more than human punchlines, humiliated for entertainment. It was a gamble, really. You either became the king's witty confidant, or the butt of every cruel joke. And those are just the opening acts. Because medieval Europe had no shortage of bizarre careers. From leech collectors, yes, people whose entire job was to scoop up blood-sucking worms for doctors, to the ale tasters who sampled beer for quality control, probably the only medieval job that actually sounds appealing. But let's not rush. We'll get to more of these odd professions soon enough. For now, let's pause here. I hope you enjoyed drifting through this first round of strange medieval jobs. And, as always, there are plenty more where that came from. So, let's quietly move on to our next story. Of rats, kings, and the people paid to chase them. So, now that we've waded through the glamorous life of the gong farmer, our medieval sanitation hero, it only feels fair to give equal credit to another profession that existed entirely because humans insisted on piling waste and food scraps everywhere. The rat catcher. Yes, this was an actual job. In an age before pest control companies with branded vans and cheerful jingles, you had men walking around with sacks, sticks, and sometimes little dogs, whose only resume was, likes to eat rodents. The rat catcher was, in many ways, the unofficial public health department of a medieval town. Though health might be a bit of a stretch, considering how often plagues were merrily spreading anyway. The rat catcher's life was not glamorous. Imagine waking up every morning, grabbing your stick, and thinking, yep, time to go find some squeaky death merchants again. And because rats were everywhere, in granaries, markets, taverns, homes, the job was never-ending. Like the medieval version of trying to keep your email inbox at zero. Every time you cleared a few, 10 more showed up. Now, the truly charming part of this profession is how people saw rat catchers. They were both needed and despised. Needed because no one wanted rats chewing their barley. Despised because, well, who really wants to chat with the guy whose clothes constantly smell like rodent fur and fleas? Rat catchers occupied this strange social middle ground, technically useful, socially avoided. Like that coworker who always volunteers for bathroom duty in the office, and everyone is thankful but also avoids eye contact. Some rat catchers got creative. They didn't just kill rats, they caught them alive. Why? Because apparently, it was considered entertainment to release captured rats in a pit and watch dogs tear them apart while people placed bets. Medieval fun was, let's say, different. So yes, rat catchers sometimes doubled as suppliers for the medieval version of pay-per-view. And then there's the fascinating crossover with medicine. Believe it or not, rats were sometimes used in folk remedies. Rat fat, for example, was thought to cure baldness if rubbed on the scalp. Which, spoiler alert, it didn't. But this gave some rat catchers a little side hustle in the wellness industry. Like medieval influencers, they were selling you questionable cures. Of course, their work took on grim, new meaning when the Black Death rolled into Europe in the mid-14th century. Suddenly, rat catchers weren't just annoying exterminators. They were frontline workers in the world's worst pandemic. Not that anyone really understood how fleas on rats were spreading the disease. People just knew. Fewer rats, maybe fewer deaths. A logic that sort of made sense, even if it was about 100 years premature in understanding germs. And here's the irony. Many rat catchers themselves probably carried fleas and diseases from house to house, unintentionally spreading what they were hired to stop. The medieval version of, I fixed your problem by making it worse. But beyond rats, medieval society had a whole collection of these odd little professions. Many existed simply because hygiene wasn't really a thing yet. And others? Well, They existed because kings, queens, and nobles were absurdly dramatic people who insisted on turning every aspect of their lives into a performance. Which brings us neatly into another job category entirely. Let's float away from rodents and filth and stroll into the glittering, slightly ridiculous world of royal entertainment. Specifically, the court jester. The court jester paid to be ridiculous. So, after wandering through the alleys with rat catchers and their squeaky sacks of doom, let's gently step into a very different scene. The medieval royal court. You know, chandeliers, or at least candles that dripped wax onto everything. Golden goblets, fur-trimmed robes, and in the middle of it all, a grown man in bells and mismatched clothes whose actual job description was make the king laugh, or else. Yes, the court jester. Probably one of the most famous medieval jobs, but also one of the most misunderstood. People picture them juggling or telling knock-knock jokes. In reality, their work was a strange mix of comedian, therapist, and sometimes brutally honest critic. They were entertainers, but they were also allowed to say things nobody else dared to. Imagine the king is having one of his famous meltdowns because his wife had yet another stillbirth, or because some cousin from France won't stop invading. Everyone else in the room is nodding silently, terrified to breathe wrong. But the jester? He could lean over, crack a sarcastic joke, and get away with it. In fact, he was expected to. That's the thing about jesters. They lived in this bizarre loophole of royal politics. Technically, they were lowly servants. But functionally, they had more freedom of speech than most nobles. If a knight insulted the king, it was treason. If the jester did it, it was good fun. Not that their lives were all rainbows and bells. Their job security depended entirely on the mood of the monarch. If your jokes didn't land, you could be tossed out, beaten, or in some unfortunate cases, executed. No one ever writes that part into the fairy tales. One famous example is Will Somers, jester to King Henry VIII of England. Yes, the same Henry who cycled through wives like a medieval Tinder addict. Will Somers somehow survived Henry's moods, his divorces, and his executions, probably because he knew exactly how to tease without crossing the line. He even managed to stay on as a favorite through the reigns of Henry's children. That's honestly more stable than most nobles managed. But not all jesters had such cushy gigs. Some were disabled or had physical differences, and were hired specifically to be laughed at rather than with. A cruel reality of the medieval taste for entertainment. Others had to do dangerous stunts, juggling knives, tumbling off platforms, basically auditioning for medieval America's Got Talent. Still, for all the humiliation, being a jester had its perks. You lived in the castle. You had the king's ear. You didn't have to shovel human waste or catch rats. Compared to most medieval jobs, wearing silly clothes and cracking jokes was a pretty sweet deal. And oddly enough, some jesters were actually respected. They weren't just clowns. They were advisors, confidants, even truth-tellers disguised as fools. Their humor could defuse tensions, soften bad news, or cleverly criticize without sparking a rebellion. Which makes the court jester less of a joke and more of a medieval spin doctor with bells on his hat. So yes, while rat catchers fought disease and gong farmers battled sewage, the jester was there in the castle, reminding the king he wasn't a god, but a man who sometimes needed to laugh at himself. And in a world of endless plagues and wars, maybe that was just as valuable as a clean street. But medieval odd jobs didn't stop there. Because once you've got jesters to cheer you up, you also need, well, food. And someone had to make sure that food didn't kill you. The royal food taster, eating for survival, but not your own. Alright, so we've had our laughs with the jester. Now picture this. You're sitting at a royal feast. The table is groaning under roasted swans, pies filled with things that should never have gone into pies, and enough wine to drown a bishop. But here's the problem. Every single dish might be poisoned. Because apparently, poisoning was the medieval equivalent of sending a strongly worded email. Enter the royal food taster. Their job was simple on paper, absolutely miserable in reality. Taste the king's food first. If you keel over, well, sorry about that, but thanks for your service. It sounds like a death sentence, and in some cases, it probably was. Poison was a constant fear in royal courts, especially in the Renaissance when every Italian noble family seemed to be experimenting with arsenic like it was a new skincare line. But ironically, the job wasn't always as deadly as it sounds. Real, successful poisonings were actually pretty rare. Not because people weren't trying, but because making poison both deadly and undetectable was harder than Netflix documentaries would have you believe. Still, the paranoia was real. Kings and queens were terrified of betrayal from within, which meant food tasters weren't just there for the food. They were also a psychological comfort blanket. If he's still alive after 3 bites, I'm probably safe. Probably. Some tasters became almost celebrities in their own right. For example, during the time of the Roman Empire, yes, even before medieval Europe, emperors had whole teams of slaves called pregustators whose sole job was to taste wine and food. If the emperor made it through dinner without convulsions, they had done their job. In medieval and early modern courts, the position could be quite prestigious. Being trusted enough to guard the monarch's life, even by eating, meant you were often close to the royal household. Some food tasters were knights or nobles, not just unlucky servants. Though honestly, I'd rather risk being stabbed in battle than slowly poisoned by mushroom stew. One of the most famous modern examples was actually during World War II. Hitler, paranoid as ever, had a team of food tasters, most of them women. One of them, Margot Wolk, survived the war and later described how every meal was nerve-wracking. They'd taste his vegetarian dishes. Yes, Hitler was a vegetarian, and then sit around for an hour to see if anyone dropped dead. If not, the Führer would finally eat. Imagine that being your daily routine. Lunch might kill me. Again, but back to medieval Europe. This job was more than just a matter of taste testing. It was theater, a ritual of safety. At banquets, food tasters performed their role publicly, reassuring everyone that the king's goose or boar's head hadn't been tampered with. It was like a medieval trust fall, except instead of falling backwards, you're swallowing potential cyanide. Did tasters ever fake it? Oh, definitely. Some sources suggest that clever tasters could switch food, pretend to chew, or bribe kitchen staff. Because let's be honest, if you were stuck eating King Richard's mystery stew every night, you might get creative. Of course, poisoning wasn't the only danger at a medieval banquet. Sometimes the food itself was hazardous without any help. Undercooked pork, spoiled wine, fish that had been sitting out since the last crusade. Yeah, plenty of royals died of mysterious illness that was probably just food poisoning in the normal sense. Which, ironically, made the taster's job harder. Were you about to die from arsenic, or just bad chicken? So yes, the royal food taster lived a bizarre existence. Close to power, trusted by the monarch, yet constantly one bite away from disaster. Not exactly the dream career your medieval guidance counselor would recommend. And speaking of weird jobs tied to food, if the monarch survived the meal, you still had to worry about what happened afterwards. Which leads us, awkwardly but inevitably, to one of the strangest and honestly most uncomfortable jobs of them all, the groom of the stool. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. I hope you enjoyed drifting through these strange little corners of medieval life with me. Thanks for listening, and may your dreams be a lot less weird than the jobs we just talked about. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.